So welcome everybody to the plenary session of this morning. It is a great pleasure to introduce Lindsay here with us, Lindsay Gillson. Lindsay Gillson is a professor at the Plant Conservation Unit, University of Cape Town in South Africa. And her interests are in ecosystem ecology, conservation, biology, and applied paleoecology, and particularly of the African savannas. And currently, she is leading research projects in Southern Africa and Madagascar. Her research focuses on long-term ecosystem dynamics. She is a worldwide leader for the implication of paleosciences in conservation, sustainability, and ecosystem services. And she likes to conduct multidisciplinary studies, including socio-ecological aspects. So thanks for being with us, Lindsay, and I pass the word to you.
Thanks very much, Willie, for that nice introduction. And thank you to the organisers for the invitation. It's a real honour to be here. Can I just check that you can see my slides properly?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So as we know, Africa holds critical and unique biodiversity. A lot of the continent is covered by savannas, grasslands, Afro-temperate forests and deserts. And it also has some mega diverse ecosystems such as fynbos tropical forest and succulent karoo. It's the only continent on the planet with a practically intact megafauna. And in addition to this, a large proportion of the land area has fire-adapted ecosystems such as grasslands, savannas and fynbos. In addition to this biological complexity, the continent also has a long history of human management of landscapes. And in the present day, a large proportion of the population is rural, so directly depends on ecosystem services. So this is the context in which biodiversity conservation is taking place today. And in this talk, I'm going to argue that paleoecology can contribute to an integrated understanding of landscape change and in turn inform the conservation of these complex social ecological systems. So in the early days of conservation, there was a lot of emphasis on preventing change, for example, culling animals to keep populations within perceived carrying capacities or fire suppression because disturbance was seen as a bad thing. But in the late 20th century, ecological paradigms shifted and ecologists and conservationists recognized that change rather than balance was the norm and that people are part of ecosystems. So this raised a lot of interesting questions for conservation. So if we know variability is normal, how do we know how much variable is too much and when might we hit critical thresholds? In other words, how resilient are ecosystem processes to things like climate change and disturbance? We also need to think about how to integrate the biocultural heritage of landscapes and think about present day needs. In other words, which ecosystem services people value most. In a case where multiple landscape states are possible, which one is the right one? So people have choices to make about how they manage landscapes and push them or prevent changes between alternate stable states. So paleoecologists can contribute to these debates as part of a transdisciplinary approach that blends our long-term data with social ecological information. And we also, of course, need to think about adaptation to the future. The past is an imperfect analog for the future, so we need to look ahead as well. So why do we need long-term data? Using data from only the present and the most recent decades is likely to give a very skewed and atypical picture of ecosystem dynamics. And yet most of the parks and protected areas in Africa were founded in the mid-20th century, which is a very atypical period in the continent's history, which is nevertheless often used as some kind of baseline. So why is that a problem? Well, many landscapes were managed for centuries or millennia, for example, through pastoralism or fire management, and this was disrupted in the colonial era when landscapes were drastically transformed. So if you think about the last few hundred years, we've had the impact of the ivory trade, which depleted elephant populations, another megafauna. We had the introduction of rinderpest, which hit herbivore populations hard. I've already mentioned fire suppression. And there was also a lot of effort in some areas to eradicate carnivores, which were considered pests. So despite all of this change, in conservation, we're only usually working with a few decades of very unusual data. So thinking in the longer term, what sort of timescales might we find useful? Well, at least since the 1950s, known as the Great Acceleration, land use has intensified greatly. So the data we have from satellite imagery, for example, only covers this very intense period of use. If we look back before the 19th century, we can think about how the intensification of agriculture, the loss of megafauna and fire suppression might have all affected landscapes. So to look beyond these kind of colonial impacts, we need to look at least 500 years in sub-Saharan Africa. We also might like to think about what happened to ecosystems and social ecological systems in past warmer periods. So we might think, roughly 1,000 years ago in the medieval climate anomaly, or 6,000 years ago or so during the mid-Holocene altithermal. And then in Southern Africa, at least, the arrival of pastoralists could have also had a big effect on landscapes. So these are some of the timescales that would be useful and interesting to conservationists. And my message here is that choosing only one snapshot in time is going to be a problem because ecosystems are dynamic and complex. And in addition to this, I'd argue that we also need to think across a range of spatial scales to examine how large-scale processes interact with smaller-scale processes. So we could think of global drivers like climate change or carbon dioxide enrichment that managers and conservationists can't really control, but they can control the effects of this at the landscape scale. For example, carbon dioxide leading to woody plant recruitment. You can't control carbon dioxide, but you can increase burning and herbivory, for example. So we also need to think across a range of spatial scales as well. So at the landscape scale, I think paleoecology has some important contributions to make. And more specifically, I think we as paleoecologists can contribute to debates over, for example, fire management, the management of herbivores and rewilding of landscapes where megafauna have been lost, ecosystem restoration based on the range of variability and resilience, and this is particularly important at the moment with the global drive to plant trees everywhere. We actually need to know where forests used to be and what they were made of. We need to think about cultural landscapes and how we might reinstate customary management in areas where people were removed in the past. And of course, we need to think about adaptation to climate change and sustainable use of natural resources. So to do this, we need to look ahead as well. So the diagram on the right shows our past, present, future perspective, which shows how these range of long-term data sets can contribute to understanding not only how we understand present landscapes, but how we might think about future changes under different economic, social, and ecological scenarios. So as well as this long-term perspective, I'm also arguing here for a multi-proxy approach. So obviously fossil pollen is very important in reconstructing land cover change, but we can't really use pollen as a climate proxy as well, because then you get into a circular reasoning. So we also need an independent climate proxy, which can be things like isotopes or diatoms. And then if we're looking at land cover change, in order for this to be useful, we need to think about the processes that drive that change. So that means reconstructing things like fire and herbivory as well, using other proxies. And all of this is complemented by other strands of research, including historical documents and repeat photographs, archaeological records. And in addition, we can blend this with current stakeholder knowledge of how they remember landscape change, how they use resources, and local ecological knowledge. So our work, I think, can contribute to a nuanced understanding of landscape history and the feedbacks in complex social ecological systems, which can help in making good conservation decisions. So I'm going to illustrate this with a case study from Bobwata National Park in Namibia. This was a project initiated by Glynis Humphrey, who wanted to look at change on decadal scales and stakeholder use of fire. And then we extended the timescale, adding in some paleo dimensions. So there's a whole team of people who became involved in this project. I'm just mentioning them all here and acknowledging all the hard work that went on to bring this together. So Borbata National Park is in northeast Namibia. The area was originally occupied by hunter-gatherers who used fire to help in their livelihood strategies, and then later pastoralists who also manipulated fire as well. But from 1888, the colonial government instigated a fire suppression policy, and this continued beyond independence and actually only changed in 2006 when there was a change to an early season burning policy. So in addition to this sort of complicated landscape history, we also know that in recent decades, woody plants have been thickening in the park, and whether you think that's good or bad might depend on the history of the landscape. So we developed some research questions around 3 different timescales: the present, the recent past, and the longer term, using stakeholder interviews, satellite imagery, and repeat photographs, and then paleoecology, so that we can compare the recent changes with the longer term. And then a really interesting thing about Borbata is it has both strictly protected areas, which are only lightly used for conservation and tourism, and then also multiple use areas that's in the red circle, where people can carry out livelihood strategies like pastoralism and growing crops, for example. So this gave us the chance to look not only back through time, but also spatially about how different land uses affected woody vegetation cover and fire. So these are the sort of timescales that we tried to look at in this project. So you can think of fire on monthly or seasonal scales, where we look at rainfall and biomass. You can think of longer term scales like variability in ENSO, for example, and then a meta-fire regime determined by overall rainfall, because that determines grass biomass. And then you can think about how people can manipulate that fire regime on different timescales. So how can this multi-proxy approach provide evidence of recent changes in woody cover, and can we use that to inform fire management going forward? So looking at the results, the present results was conducted by Glynis as part of her PhD, and she interviewed various stakeholders, including communities in the park and conservationists, about why, when, how, and why they burned, and what perceptions there were around the seasonal use of fire. And Glynis found a whole host of interrelated reasons why and how people use fire. There's one related to hunting. So for example, to attract game, to make tracking easier, and to protect from dangerous animals. There's another cluster around pastoralism, which again is to improve grazing for domestic stock. Then there's another cluster around gathering felt food, or so wild food resources. And then there's another cluster around growing crops. So there are all sorts of reasons why people use early burning for tracking and hunting, etc., and then late burning for getting land ready for crops. Then Glynis and Connor Eastman looked back over the last few decades using remote sensing, GIS and repeat photography, and then statistical modeling to look at landscape change on decadal scales. And the results showed that in the west of the park, the shrub grass mosaic was increasing and trees were declining, and this was associated with late season burning and hot fires. Whereas in the east of the park, large trees survived, and this was associated with higher human population and more early season burning. And then the statistical modelling showed that land use and fire frequency on these timescales were the most important predictors of fire. But what did that compare with the longer term? And this is Adele Julia's postdoc work. So she looked back over the last 1,000 years or so to see, first of all, how that policy of 100 years of fire suppression affected the landscape, and then to work with Glynis and the team to try and work out how that might inform modern management practices. So this is one of Adele's pollen diagrams. You can see that it's, as most savanna landscapes, it's very grassy and open. There's a lot of poaceae pollen. Tree cover was pretty stable, though arguably a bit higher at the base of the core 1,000 years ago. You can see that herbivores were present, except for this gap, 1300 to 1500 AD. And you can see that fire was present throughout the history of the landscape, and perhaps more prevalent at the base of the core. The other pollen diagram from the east of the park was remarkably similar, so I'll just skip through it. Open landscapes, pretty stable woody cover, present but variable herbivore presence, and then fire throughout the record, possibly increasing after the arrival of pastoralists. And then Adele compared this with an independent climate proxy and suggests that the lower Poaceae at the base of the core was possibly linked to a wetter period, whereas later on there was less of a clear link with climate, and that's to do with the arrival of pastoralists. So if we put all this together, we couldn't actually see any evidence of 100 years of fire suppression policy. So it suggests that this policy didn't work, either because fires happened anyway or people burned anyway. There was possibly a bit of an increase in fire with the arrival of pastoralists, but vegetation was pretty stable. There was a slight increase with rainfall, possibly 1,000 years ago in tree cover, and that goes well with work from Kruger National Park. So this graph, I'm not sure if you can see the detail, but it basically shows a linear relationship between area burned and preceding rainfall, regardless of what fire policy was in place. So it didn't matter if managers were trying to suppress fire, if they were trying to do controlled burning, it didn't matter. The relationship persisted. Then looking at the recent past, the remote sensing work showed that bush encroachment is occurring and is mainly attributed to land use, as well as some of the effect of fire seasonality and possibly rising CO2. The change in the fire suppression policy to early season burning didn't seem to have an effect, but we can see this interaction between fire frequency and rainfall to predict woody cover change. And then what we saw by looking at the current stakeholder perspective was this nice convergence between what conservationists wanted and what communities wanted, because they're both interested in early season burning. Both groups of people perceive it to be beneficial for ecosystem services and biodiversity conservation, which is a really nice kind of convergence of these different knowledge streams. However, if we look ahead to the future, if we carry on with carbon dioxide enrichment, which might drive further tree recruitment, managers might need to bring back some intense burns in the late season if they want to curb this shrub encroachment. So that was the case study from Namibia. And the other one I want to talk to you about is from the Kruger, and this Kruger National Park in South Africa. This work took place over many years. I hope it's not over familiar. I think the concepts are still relevant and perhaps could be more widely applied. So how are conservationists working with variability in South African parks? Well, they're now trying to move away from the idea of fixed goals like carrying capacity and actually working with ranges of variability called thresholds of potential concern. So instead of defining a fixed target, for example, based on some kind of baseline, they actually define areas of desirable and undesirable change, and they try and keep an ecosystem parameter within the area that stakeholders deem desirable. So I think this is a really important interface for paleoecologists to work with, because we're probably familiar with concepts like historical range of variability or ecological character, and maybe even limits of acceptable change. So I think this is where we can take our knowledge on variability and actually translate it into concrete management guidance by working with conservation managers on the ground. So in savannas, as you have heard if you listen to Alison's nice plenary the other day, you can have different stable states. In these ecosystems, you can have fire-driven ecosystems alongside fire-sensitive ecosystems in the same climate space. They're alternate stable states maintained by fire vegetation soil feedbacks. So you can see in the top figure, this quite thick woody cover might eventually become a closed canopy, shading out the grass layer, excluding fire and allowing fire-sensitive forest species to establish, for example. So people can manipulate those sort of transitions. So if they want a more forested landscape, they could probably suppress fire and trying to push the system towards a more wooded state. If they want more grazing resources, for example, they might choose to burn more or even mechanically clear some of the woody vegetation. So that means that people can choose within what's ecologically possible the state that they deem desirable. So this is what TPCs might look like, thresholds of potential concern, if we think about elephant populations and tree density on the two axes here. We have two undesirable states. In the bottom left, you can see a degraded landscape with not many trees and not many elephants. In the top right, you can see a very unstable state with lots of trees and lots of elephants, which just wouldn't persist because the elephants would knock the trees down. And then between these two extremes, you've got a range of ecological possibilities that different people might find desirable. So tourists might like a landscape with lots of elephants and not many trees for good game viewing, whereas farmers might prefer the opposite. So if you're a manager, you can consult with stakeholder groups and see, for example, if there's a state which both user groups find acceptable, or you might choose to implement different management thresholds inside and outside of the park so that different people can get what they want out of landscapes. So you can see here we're working with ideas of ecological resilience, but also what is socially desirable as well. And you'll notice that the management thresholds are conservative. So in other words, you don't want to wait until the ecosystem is tipping to an undesirable state before you act. You set the threshold of potential concern sort of conservatively. So we did some paleoecological work in the Kruger and the Greater Limpopo Park in Mozambique with these ideas in mind. So we look for these transitions in our fossil pollen data, and then we calibrated the data to give estimates of tree cover, because managers don't really want to know about arboreal pollen abundance. They want to know about changes in tree cover. So we did the calibration work. And then we also used other proxies so that we could look at what might be driving transitions between stable states. So we used charcoal and spores and delta 15N, for example, to look at fire, herbivory, and nutrients and how they interact. And then we interpreted our results in terms of resilience theory and thresholds of potential concern. So what might a transition look like in the paleo record? And there's lots of interesting work going on in this now. If you heard Tim Lenton's talk, for example, or you might be familiar with Alistair Seddon's work on EcoRe3. But back then we didn't know all of that. So we just plotted the frequency distribution of our pollen data, because what we thought was, if this was just a sort of gradient between more and less wooded landscapes, we'd get a normal distribution. But if it was a transition between alternate stable states, we'd expect a bimodal distribution. So this is a grass pollen abundance, and you can see very clearly that it's bimodally distributed. So based on that, we started developing conceptual models that might explain these transitions between alternate stable states. So we're now using diagrams that ecologists and managers can actually relate to. So we're several steps down the line from a pollen diagram and using ecological concepts that can be relatable for managers. So this is what we did for one of the sites, Manala Panga, where we saw a clear transition between a grazing lawn and a wooded savanna. But then we looked at many other sites. I think there were 10 in total, and many thanks to Annelie Ekblom for all the hard work in counting pollen. So then what we did was we pooled all of these sites together and identified 4 different, what we think are stable states in the vegetation. So a water scarce grassland where trees can't establish because it's too dry, a grazing lawn where trees could establish, but it's maintained by herbivores and competition for nitrogen. Then a fire-maintained semi-arid savanna, and then forested landscapes, for example, along rivers where grasses are shaded out and there's not enough biomass to support fire. So then working with that, which was basically based on our paleo records, we then tried to make this into the same sort of diagram that managers use when they're developing thresholds of potential concern. So you can see here are 4 different vegetation states, and we've tried to map these onto ecological thresholds and management thresholds. So if we go back now, so this is water availability versus tree density. So if we go back now to our diagram, you can see that if managers and stakeholders don't want some of these transitions, so they don't want a more wooded landscape, They could perhaps try and prevent tree recruitment by increased fire, or maybe allowing the herbivore population to increase, and vice versa. If they want to promote the presence of grazing lawns in the landscape because of tourism or biodiversity reasons, they might do the opposite. So in other words, the transitions are ecological, but stakeholders get to decide whether they're good or bad, and plan management that either facilitates or prevents these transitions. So some take-home messages from these two case studies. The perceptions we have of landscape change are influenced by the timescales of observation. So you can see on the diagram on the right, the same increase in woody plant density might be perceived differently depending on the history of the landscape. So is it a recovery from past woody plant clearance? Is it an unprecedented increase due to, for example, carbon dioxide enrichment? And the management response would be different. But a lot of the time, managers are working without that information. So I think this is a really where we as paleoecologists could be really useful. I think our long-term data is essential in providing this a context, so the history of the landscape, and even more so if we can interpret it in terms of resilience as well. If we understand the processes that drive transitions between stable states, for example, alongside stakeholder preferences, we can really assist in planning appropriate management responses. And in addition, if we've got this process-based understanding and we have an idea of how scenarios of climate and land use might change in the future, we might be able to help stakeholders think through different possible future scenarios, depending on what climate conditions will prevail and also what people want out of landscapes. So finally, just to finish off, I would like to just suggest some ways forward. You're probably familiar, a lot of paleoecological papers finish with a sentence on "and our work has important implications for conservation," but they don't say what they are. So how do we actually make our work more useful? I think we need to do a lot more work on calibration. Managers and conservationists don't want to work with pollen diagrams. They want to work with data in forms that relate to the parameters they want to manage, like tree cover, like animal population size, for example. So we have to be creative about how we present the data, and it's been great to see that in this conference, how people's diagrams are becoming more accessible. And yes, we need pollen diagrams for ourselves, but they can be kind of behind the scenes, depending on who our audience is. And then I also think, our chronologies have to be good, and that's not always easy if you're working in landscapes which are semi-arid or have lots of megafauna, but a robust chronology is important in convincing managers that we're working, our work is relevant to them. And I also think we've got to think about timescales, because most managers are really only interested in the past few hundred or past few thousand years, perhaps the mid-Holocene when it was warmer. But they can't really use information on, for example, what happened when the climate was much colder, because we're not heading in that direction. So I think, again, like packaging our work for different audiences, presenting it in different journals and at different conferences would really try and make our work more accessible, as well as kind of really trying to develop this interface with neoecology and ecological theory. It provides a common language where we can discuss our work in ways that are more relatable. I also think we shouldn't be afraid to engage directly with conservation and restoration questions. Are people burning too much? We can give some opinion on that. It might not be a definitive answer, but it will help guide going forward. And I think particularly in restoration, there's a lot of contributions we could make. I've already mentioned the reforestation and carbon storage, and a lot of that is not based on a sound understanding of landscape history. So I think we could contribute there. And I just want to draw your attention to the recent issue of Pages magazine, where we've drew together some really nice case studies on how paleoecologists are engaging with restoration. And then I think we do need to consult more with communities and stakeholders, and with people from other disciplines. So even from the start of the project, finding out what questions people are interested in who are managing the landscape, or what they want from a landscape in the future, might help us design the project in ways that are useful and meaningful to people. And then, you know, the past is an imperfect analog for the future. So I think modeling based on our a process-based understanding will make our work more relevant for looking ahead. So if we can model past changes and then use that to explore different future scenarios in ways that are easy for managers to interact with. So I'm imagining here a tool where a manager could say, this is what would happen if I burned at this frequency, or my herbivore population was this size. So I would think kind of moving towards those kind of interactive management tools would be really important in making our work relevant. So I'd like to thank our many funders and collaborators who made all of this work possible. To the audience for your attention, the organising committees for their invitation and all the work behind the scenes, and also ShopLogic, who are doing such a great job of running everything. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for this very nice insights into applications of paleoecology for conservation and for management. And we are slightly over time, but there might be some questions. I just check. No, I don't see any yet, so but I would have one. So you didn't see for the Namibia case study, so you didn't see any kind of let's say suppression in your records. So the effects of the suppression that was done in both directions, one suppression and then actually active fire management. Why this? Is that because really this doesn't have any kind of implications what we do in terms of fire management, or is this because your records don't have the sensitivity to show that, or the chronology or the resolution? Yeah. I don't know what.
Yeah, thanks, Willie. So I think one issue, the kind of ecological answer is that grass biomass overrides almost everything, and that is defined by antecedent rainfall. So the amount of fire in a landscape is basically defined by the amount of fuel. So fire will increase or decrease depending on how dry. So actually you get more fire in seasonal landscapes when it's wetter because of more biomass, which is a bit counterintuitive. So there's that side of it. But then on the other hand, it doesn't mean that people don't manipulate fire. They do, they manipulate it through seasonality. So instead of having all of the area burned at the end of the dry season, which would be a very hot, intense fire, they light small fires early in the dry season before all of the vegetation's dried out. And what you end up then is a very patchy mosaic type burn, which is much better for ecosystem services because you end up with a range of different post-fire ages. So people can manage fire and can make a difference to what fire does, but the kind of boundary conditions are climate. There is work by Sally Archibald and others that shows as landscapes become more fragmented, fire doesn't spread as easily. So that's another way that people can influence fire. And then, yeah, of course, we acknowledge that in these semi-arid land, we don't get these beautifully resolved records. We just don't. I've never got anywhere close to annual resolution in any of these semi-arid savannas, but I think we can at least get towards decadal. So 100 years of fire suppression should have shown up, you know, even if not at a very high resolution. So I'm kind of like cautiously confident in the results. I couldn't say definitively that we've caught every nuance, but I think 100 years should have showed, even with our relatively poor chronologies. Yeah.
Thank you, Lindsay, for answering this question. So it's 35, and I think I don't see any questions still in here, open questions. So maybe we just close here. And we say again, thank you very much for this very insightful presentation on applications of paleoecology to conservation and management. Thank you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Willie. Thanks, everyone.